The roll call, Lori Boyette, Scott Christopher. Where's Scott?
He was here 2 seconds ago.
Brian Eastridge. Brian is actually at the Capitol with Dinah. Dr. Gandhi.
Here.
Carla Kosak. Elmo Lopez.
Here.
Lisa Price. Lisa Price was not able to join us. Alex Ramos.
Here.
Christy Reeves.
Here.
Kathy Rogers.
Here.
Lori Vinson.
Here.
And Dr. Robert Winchell.
Here.
So before we get started, we do have 2 new members for our committee, so we'll ask them to introduce themselves and give a little background on where they're from. So we will start with you, Mr. Lopez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Elmo Lopez. I come from the CEO world of hospital management, and I'm in McAllen, Texas.
Welcome. Dr. Winchell, would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Sure. My name is Dr. Robert Winchell. I'm a trauma surgeon, currently chief of trauma at Memorial Hermann in Houston.
So this is the legislative process. Does anybody know we're not in session? That's a joke, y'all. So the bottom line is I want to go over the data that we have shared and talked about so everybody has access to this. This is posted on the website. So if you have any questions or you would like this, if you want it, ask your RAC chairs. I'm going to send it to all the RAC chairs. So this data comes from the registry, the state trauma registry. So again, you can see the breakdown for the level 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s and the non-designated hospitals. So if you look at this, there are 578 hospitals that are participating in the state trauma registry. So if you look at the breakdown of hospitals participating in the data, you can see the level 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and the non-designated. So again, there are 19,000 patients coming in, records coming in from the non-designated hospitals. And in talking to individuals, they feel like these are the hospitals that are in pursuit for the designation. If you look at the hospitals by trauma center, again, you can just see a breakdown. 33% of the records are coming from the level 1 trauma centers, 9% from the level 2s, 23% from the level 3 trauma centers, and 19% from the level 4s, and again, 16% from those non-designated hospitals. So we looked at the charges. This is the 2013 data, and I have to recognize Chris Drucker because this data came from his group. So you can see that $4,408,911,772 were charged on the records that are currently in the registry for 2013. Conditions of discharge. So 3,000 Texans were arrived in hospitals and the trauma centers that died from trauma. So we can't say that's a total number of deaths because there may have been patients that were transported to hospitals that needed airway or potentially were DOA that somehow or another did not get registered or sent into the registry. So this is an old slide. This is 2012. So if you look at the bottom of that, you will see in 2012 we reported to the legislation that there were 117,112 trauma patients managed in the trauma centers. And of those patients, there was a 2.7% mortality rate. So if you look at the far right, what you'll see is the National Trauma Data Bank in 2012 had a mortality rate of 3.8. So we are lower than the national average in the National Trauma Data Bank. So if you look at the 2013 data, and again, this is from Chris Drucker and his team, there were 121,303 records reported in 2013. And if you look to the far right, you'll see that our mortality rate was 2.6%. Now, Some of this data, so some hospitals haven't submitted all this data, so this data changes, but this is the data that we pulled out for the November meeting. So that's the timeline on that data. Mechanism of injury, it's probably hard for those of you in the back of the room to see, but cuttings, piercings, drowning, if you look at this, there's a different way to look at it. Falls continues to be the #1 reason for injury in the state of Texas, followed by the motor vehicle crash. And so these are the top issues for injury. If you look, falls, motor vehicle crash, struck, this is motor pedestrian crash usually, cut, pierce, and then other transport. So if you look at the fatal injuries coming into the trauma centers, falls and motor vehicle crashes, again, are the top contenders in this particular category. So this is the data, again, from Chris's group, looking at the EMS data. So if you look at the average response times for 911 type of transfers, it's a little over 25 minutes. 911 only is a little under 30 minutes, and then transfers only, you can see, is a little over 40 minutes. And this is hospitalizations by trauma center level. I think we've already seen this. It just shows you the distribution. So I wanted to share that with you because that's the number. So again, each of the racks can access different data. We have some data I'm going to be sharing with the rack chairs as well. But the bottom line is the data is there. So when you talk to individuals, it's really nice if you can talk about these are the total numbers that we have. This is our mortality rate. And then customize it specific to your region. So I know a lot of y'all did that when we had Capitol Day on Tuesday. If you have any questions on that, you can please feel free to email me or email Chris Drucker. Any questions on the data? Any questions from the committee? Okay. So, Jane, do we have anything on the updates on the rules?
Maybe. I'm not sure I can get this done. In, let's see, March, we're going to be having some stakeholder meetings for the EMS piece of it, and we hope to be following with other sections of the rules for stakeholder meetings thereafter, sometime between the EMS meetings and the May GETAC.
Okay. Any questions from the committee members for Jane? This is going to be part of our discussion today. Most of you remember that in July we met for 2 days in San Antonio to talk about the revisions for the Trauma Strategic Plan. That plan was produced, I believe, in 2009. So the lead on that is Brian Eastridge. So he's at the Capitol with Dinah, so I'm going to turf this and see if he arrives and he can talk about it. So the next thing to talk about is the Trauma Registry Work Group. In this registry work group, these were the objectives of that particular work group: open communications, reaching out to all the stakeholders, to find the barriers from the registry, develop solutions to improve registry participation, obviously to drive changes in the system. And I think that Chris is here. We've done a great job at changing and getting input from the registry, and more importantly, providing input to the registry about the value of this data. I wasn't at the meeting on Wednesday. We had another meeting. Does anybody have any input on this meeting? Jane, Colin?
Yeah. So essentially the meeting yesterday covered some basic updates from the Trauma Registry Group. Chris, are you here? Do you want to give it?
So we covered a few items from the program. One thing we talked about was the user guide. It's nearly complete. I put a pause on it just to make sure, excuse me, we go through, everything looks great. Basically, it's for our users to be able to get a more simplified understanding of the Maven application. And a testimony of it, one of our own staff members who was new, obviously was not familiar with the Maven application. They were actually able to use this guide and work with our stakeholders. And everything worked out, so that's a testimony of the utility of the, of the user guide. The next one we talked about was the recommendation of turning registry data elements into mandatory. We took this back to do an analysis of the impact of turning all data elements mandatory, and we quickly discovered that if you do that, that means every data element has to be entered. So, for example, if you are dealing with a patient who was involved in a submersion, that means all your fire burn questions will have to be answered and everything like that. Not really sure that's the most efficient route of submitting data to the registry. So that's what we looked at with the turning of mandatory data elements. The status of NTDB and NEMSIS, I'll jump with NEMSIS quickly. As of right now, we are now waiting for NEMSIS to test our registry system. Once testing is complete, we'll know if everything's good. If everything's good, we become a certified V3 data system, and we'll be able to start collecting and ultimately submitting data up nationally. As of right now, California and Nebraska are the only states that are submitting V3 data. Our state is purple, means that we submitted documentation, but hopefully in the next 2 months we'll turn green, which means that we're submitting data up. With our latest build and production, which occurred last January, so a few weeks ago, we have implemented the 2014 NTB data standard. So those hospital facilities that were unable to submit data via XML file uploads now have that capability. So we're going to be getting all that data coming in. And these are just some of the few things that we talked about in the work group.
So one of the things that was critical is that for the hospitals to follow the National Trauma Data Bank data dictionary and the validation process. So was there any discussion on that?
There was actually no discussion about that in the work group, but that discussion did come up in another committee. It was Dr. Shinoa from the Injury Prevention Committee asked if there's any way we can validate our data. And at that time, my answer to that question was, I don't know. I did not have an answer. But thinking about it right now with the staff, what we can do as a possible way to validate is extract the data from a level 1 facility that submits up to the national organization and do a comparison of the data to see if the data are the same. If they're not, then we need to go into the system, understand why there are differences. So that's just one method in which we can validate the data, but we're also pursuing other ways that we can validate this data so that it does mirror the gold standard.
Just so everybody understands why that was an issue is what we identified is if I am behind in my registry and I enter Jory Klein, motor vehicle crash, here's her vital signs, and that's all I enter, it logs in that I entered the patient. So it says that you got the patient. But it's an incomplete record when we go to try to compare all of this information. So it leaves huge gaps, and so the group decided that the best way to get our handle on this is that everybody has to complete the National Trauma Data Bank and validate it, and if it's not complete, you can't send it in. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword. It kicks the data back to you, but if you really want good data to make decisions, you've got to make sure that the data that you get is accurate and it's complete. So any comments from the committee chairs, the committee members?
Well, I actually thought that was kind of a done deal last time. So was there any discussion about, so while there's issues with making them all mandatory, is there a smaller subset that's bigger than what we have that at least will give us, I think all of them need to be mandatory, but is there a
Correct.
smaller subset?
The way the registry works is you have parent questions fill out to child questions. If you turn every single data element mandatory, that means questions that are pertinent to the record, including the children questions, so those that pop up after initial questions answered, those questions will have to be answered as well. So to answer your question, there can be a larger set of mandatory elements besides the 9 or 10 that are there, but at most they have to be the parent questions.
Can you provide that list of parent questions?
I could generate a list of parent questions, correct. Rob, we have that capability. Yeah.
Can we have that at the next meeting?
Yeah, you can have it by the next meeting.
Okay. And then the next thing to ask about follow-up is the standalone ERs. So there was some discussion about trauma patients going to these standalone ERs somehow and then getting into the trauma center. So they're obviously typically transfers, but were these standalone ERs required to submit data because they're not really licensed as a hospital? So
The answer is that they're not required to submit data at this point in time. Now, can they accept a trauma patient? That's really going to be up to the medical director of the transporting EMS service, whether they utilize a freestanding ED.
So what we see in, at least in our areas, it's very rare that, well, that I know of, that an EMS patient transports to a standalone ER. But what we're seeing is transfers coming out. So a patient gets there and they're trying to transfer that patient out from the standalone ER. So that's how we know that they were there. And then the question that we ask them is, you know, transfer process. And so they are really not held accountable to the hospital licensure rules. So,
well, the other thing that we've seen also is they're calling a 911 response to transfer patients out at times as well. So as opposed to calling and getting acceptance of a patient, doing an MOT and the other things that a hospital would do, they're calling a 911 response at times and getting that EMS agency to come and transport that patient to another hospital. So I'm seeing that as well.
And Madam Chair, we just opened 2 of these, and we are seeing walk-ins. I mean, people, multiple gunshot wounds sometimes come in, and we have to transfer back to the hospital.
right.
The part about activating 911, getting EMS to respond through 911, they need to be able to care for an emergency patient, and they need to be able to have some sort of an agreement with EMS to come pick up a patient from them if they need to transfer someone out. Dialing 911 for the healthcare facility is not an acceptable practice. If the facility is a certified facility for Medicare, I think that actually goes against Medicare provider standards also. So if they're doing that, that's probably the conversation that would need to be had with them. Okay.
Any other committee members have any comments about this particular subject?
I just have a question. What if the freestanding ER is a campus of another hospital? Does that change anything as far as their reporting requirements or anything like that?
No, there are 2 different types of freestanding emergency departments. There are the provider-based emergency departments that are going to be basically a department of the hospital. Then there are those that are truly freestanding, that are open 24/7 and are emergency departments. If they're not open more than 24/7, they close down like after midnight, then they're not considered emergency department. They are an urgent care facility. So that would be the difference. Now, I'm not 100% sure on the provider-based freestanding ED because they're operating as a department of the hospital. I'd have to verify that. It might be that because they're under the hospital license that they would have to report, but that would be through the hospital's information because they are not a separately licensed nor separately certified facility.
I believe we are reporting together all traumas.
So it's
through
combined.
the FED or through the
Okay.
normal the hospital ED.
So just one thing, Jane, about clarification. So for those freestanding ERs that are not part of a hospital system, the expectation to transfer a patient is the same as a hospital. They get an accepting physician at that hospital, they do a memorandum of transfer, and they contact an appropriate agency to do the transfer for them, correct?
Correct.
So what you're saying is they're held accountable to CMS MTALA regulations, right?
They can't be certified by CMS. We just went through this with our freestanding, and they tried to seek CMS verification so they could do Medicare and Medicaid. CMS told them that they're not approving any freestanding ER.
So how do they get paid?
They're getting self-pay or other insurance providers.
They won't take Medicare.
Okay. I stand corrected.
Any other discussion on the standalone ERs?
Bottom line is in the grand scheme of things, it's a new animal, and it should almost be a standing agenda item for probably the next couple of years. Trauma-related issues related to standalone ERs. So I don't know.
I agree.
I think we're going to talk about this for some time to come.
I agree. I think the other thing that on the registry, just to get Chris back up here, is that there was a request that data elements be added to the registry to identify those patients that were coming from these standalone ERs. Right?
Yeah, and I think my question goes back to, if I'm a level 3 trauma center and I have several freestanding ERs that are a department of our hospital basically, and they're transferring a patient, say, to a level 1 trauma center, and they never actually enter my hospital, does that patient need to be put in the registry because they're a trauma patient? I mean, that's kind of where I'm unsure.
It sounds like if they're following your hospital licensure rules, it would be a yes. Because the hospital licensures require them to participate in the trauma registry, right?
Correct.
So I don't think everybody is aware of that.
I don't know that it's the licensure rules, the registry rules, so that all hospitals have to
Right.
submit data.
So if they're part of the hospital licensure, they would have to submit.
Yeah, if they're operating as a department. If they're operating as a department, then they're going to fall under the hospital requirements for reporting.
So,
Freestandings get access to the registry, like if we want to invite them to enter their staff? Are they eligible to get a registry login?
Christine, I'd have to look at the statute. Right now, I don't think there's anything that requires them to report. So that would take a statutory change to give us the authority to require it and the authority to keep it.
Can they give one? Like if we wanted to play nice in the sand and enter their data.
Well, we don't accept data voluntarily.
I guess I don't understand.
Chris,
I don't understand because if they're, let's say Parkland builds the standalone ERs and they are considered a department, are they not functioning under Parkland's licensure as the hospital?
Yes.
So under
That's
hospital
provider-based.
licensure rules, all hospitals are required to participate in the registry.
Right.
So that
Now, what I thought Christine was talking about was a freestanding, not a provider base. So we're talking about two different animals.
Okay. Sorry.
Am I off base, Chris? You're registry, so you.
Correct. And according to our legal, in this case, we will not accept the voluntary submission of data from those that are not supposed to be reporting by statute to the registry. And that was the legal counsel that we just received.
For the freestanding ones.
Freestanding, correct.
Jory, I have a question for Chris since he's there. Chris. That's going back to the NTDB elements, because I was part of that meeting in November, and I clearly remember that you even stated, well, it would be great if we can do it January 1st, 2015, so we can have a clean year. Then the last thing I heard was April, and we're going to go with the NTDB fields. We discussed it at Voter Rack, also give them a heads up. Is there, I know you guys are doing an excellent job. Where in your priorities is the validation to try to mirror the Texas and NTDB fields? Where on your priority list?
It's a high priority. I don't think it's a service to the state to collect data that is not meeting to the standard. It's not a service to the state to collect data that is questionable or the use is not there. And so it is a high priority for us to ensure the data that we get does follow and meet that gold standard. So this is something, when we go back, even this very next week, when we have our GETAC debrief, we're going to talk about how can we move forward with some of these pressing issues. So this will be one that's going to be up there.
And I know it takes time, and I mean, personally in our registry, we have to put ourselves a timeline and try to reach those. Do you guys have a timeline on when that would happen?
The validation of the data? As of right now, no. After our debrief, understanding where we are with our everything related to the registry, after talking with our project manager, we'll be able to develop a timeline. And I'll be glad to report that back to you, Jory, so you can share with your committee members.
Sure. I think one question I have is, it kind of goes back to Jane, is if it looks to me like when we implement the new rules, that should be part of the implementation or tied into the implementation. So if we haven't already done it, the National Trauma Data Bank
The rules
validation.
associated with that.
The
Correct.
rules associated with it, but the rules for trauma facility designation, when those rules are implemented, it looks to me like that, if that's not already implemented, it should be tied to it.
So I'm going to introduce Rob Klein. He is our project manager. He works directly with our vendor Conciliants and kind of the brain behind the registry moving forward. So he'll have a better answer in regards to the NTDB and the rule question.
Thank you, Chris. So as of today, the registry is NTDB compliant. So we have all the questions from the standard dictionary all built into the model of the registry. It is all there. We can accept every question. And that has been in place since January 1. So the key things that we had to work on since January is that we put a new build in place to help those hospitals that were submitting data through XML, and that now is in place also. So we can actually accept XML from the hospitals using all the National Trauma Data Bank elements. The key piece that we were still working on throughout January and February is we are finalizing the Texas custom elements. So these are different. These are the extra 50 some elements that we wanted to collect that came from the registry work group over the last couple of years that we wanted to collect information specific to Texas. Now, those are all basically in place in the registry since January. There have been some few tweaks in place and making a few changes. When we went back to National Trauma Data Bank, the organization, we did a review. There was some duplication of effort there from questions you already had in there, so we decided to clean it up, and we've gone through that process. So we're just finalizing that process now. We've been working with the vendors, and we should have that National Trauma Data Bank complete set completed hopefully by the end of this month, if not by the middle of March.
Okay.
So we're in very good shape as far as the National Trauma Data Bank.
And the
elements.
validation. So
All the validation rules that are with the standards are also built into. So that's all part of it. So if a date range is not supposed to be for a length of stay or something that we have is for when the hospital date, it'll actually flag that and give you an error for that. So we have gone through that process, we've checked those rules, and we can continue to test that process as we go forward.
Will that give you a report back? And I think that's what George
Yes,
said.
one of the key things we did, it has been taken most of this past year, is one of our key stakeholder requests was let's get some information back to us to see what we're non-compliant with. So we now have, won't be with the legacy data, it'll only be with the new XML uploads. But when hospitals actually send their data to us, the submitter actually now gets an emailed PDF report. That report goes right back. It gives you a summary top page, and the secondary page you have is all the details. It'll give you every element which you had an error with. It'll give you every element you have a warning with. If a date range is out or something, we might still accept that data. And it'll also tell you if the question is it's incomplete, has not been completely filled out. That is all in place in the PDF, and we have that working as of today. So all those pieces are in place. We're now just trying to make sure now we'll get everybody on board. We've worked with certain stakeholders in making sure their vendors can actually send us the data, because there are some header issues and stuff like that, technical issues. We're working with them. Those vendors are making those changes. The only key thing the vendors have asked us to kind of work a little more stringent on is our Texas custom codes, because they're trying to build all those in for you also. So those are the kind of key thing we're trying to kind of clean up at this point in time.
One more. Excellent. I mean, the progress it's been vast since November. Would the data still be taken even though there's flags? So we're still trying to think back to the NTDB level 1, 2 flags.
The data is still taken at this time. Right now, we have not put any restrictions on taking the data. The issue we do have is if we go to this mandatory, what we're talking about, it's either all or nothing kind of thing. So you're going to get a full report saying can't accept any records. We didn't really want to go that way. We want to see what's coming in first, see what's missing, what the gaps are, and then put certain elements that as we go through the committee process here. Okay, let's put this one mandatory. Let's look at this mandatory. Let's look what we can do. But we're trying to work with our stakeholders and with our vendors to make sure they can actually get data in the system at this point in time. Over this next year, if we find that we want to increase the completeness of our data, then we can continue adding those mandatory codes in there.
So let me ask you this. So this is February.
Right.
So if I go back into the registry and look at all of 2013, and you have the same process that's in place as what you're talking about, the National Trauma Data Bank and the validation, can you tell me how many of the records had validation issues?
We have also built a case validation report, and it can be run by entity, RAC, and for the full state. So each entity can go in there and take a look at their own data. It is an aggregation of numbers. So it will give you a total number of records that you submitted for that particular year, and then it will break down each. It just has the Texas custom codes, but it has every NTB element that are required. So we have just the required elements, and it'll give you a list of all the required elements, and if it has been populated with a valid answer, a null value, or it's blank. We have that report is available today. We're just in the latest build, we're doing a few changes to that, and that should be ready within the next month or so.
So for me, this is pretty critical, because if you look at this slide, we're going around telling everybody we're really good. Our mortality rate is 2.6%. If we get a report back from you that if we had that validation that was in place that said 60% of the records are not complete, then we're kind of like stupid out there. So, I think this is a critical issue for the state to be able to say, our data is good, it's complete, so if we have an issue with the validation and the records are not complete, then this turns into something that's really not very valuable at all.
I would totally agree with you, and that's why we're really pushing forward with trying to go to the national standards, trying to work with the rules in validations for that data, and also work with actually when the data comes in, checking with the validity report to actually see what has been entered correctly, or what is we consider a valid answer and which is not a valid answer, a blank. They didn't complete it, was complete the answer. And each entity can look at that. They're going to be able to get a look at their records for that year and be able to tell where they're at.
So that's in place today, you said to tell us, right?
That the report is ready. We're just doing a few changes to make sure it's running properly. But we should have that ready in the next month or so.
So will it go back and do the validation on these records?
It will It will look from, we have it run from, I believe, from 2010 through 2015 right now. Just remember, though, that 2010 through 2013, part of 14, we're looking at legacy elements. So if they're blanks, we didn't have to have that data in there, so I wouldn't think the value of that might not be as great.
So I'm going to ask Terry Rowden to lock the door in the back and turn off all the microphones, because if there's data that we go back and look at that says that this is incomplete data, can you just not release it till June?
We would rack with the 13% death rate that we're at.
So, I mean, the reason I say that is because we're using this data for the session. So if we're using data that's incomplete and wrong, I would just request that you wait.
I wouldn't say it's totally incomplete. I think there's certain elements that we can't make judgments on, but the elements that we do have there, we can look at with the records that we are and base it on that. You know, we're going to have this, the old data back, previous data, we're always going to have challenges with, because we're not at the National Trauma Data Bank standard. As in 2015, we're going to be there, and so going forward, we should see much more accurate data.
I just built a custom registry that had and the old registry had 100,000 records in it, so I know all about that. So I just applaud you for being able to do what you're doing, but I think the critical element for everybody on this committee and everybody in a seat out here is that if we're going to use data to make decisions, and I would hope that we're in a world that that's what we're going to be doing, there has to be some way to validate that this information is correct and in a timely manner. So we're all saying we're doing a good job, and we all think we're doing a really good job, but if we found out that 60% of the records were incomplete, then I would have to say, well, I don't know that we're doing a good job.
Correct, and like Rob said, once that validation process module is finalized and we run the report, we can run it at the entity, at the RAC, and at the state level. So you could find out specifically the proportion of records that are complete, not complete by your submitting facility, or at the RAC level, or at the state level.
My question may be to Jane and Chris. Is there currently, or what is the potential of creating some kind of a penalty process for an entity that, you couldn't do it for if they had one invalid record, but if they had a certain percentage of invalid records, is there any potential that we could create a penalty process in the trauma rule, or just to kind of incentivize those entities to make sure that their data is good?
I believe it's a great
registry.
I'm going to tell them that Scott's going to come see them. That's what I'm going to tell them.
Terry, I'm talking about data entry at the hospital level.
Because ours was obviously a mapping problem. We have a 2.97% death rate. So our facility came out and showing a 13%. And it was strictly a mapping problem between Lancet and the data. And our data was right with the NTDB. So.
Well, and initially, I think those are the kinds of issues that this will point out, and so we just have to work through it. We had the same thing on the EMS side when we were looking at providers that were not reporting. There were many providers that thought they were reporting, but their records weren't being accepted. So it took them going back and working with their third party who was submitting records to work through some of that. So this is going to take us a while, Scott, and then once we kind of filter through and get those issues taken care of, then we need to start looking at the education and training of the people that are entering the data on the facility side.
So I have another question sort of along Scott's line. So today, we just had our trauma site survey. It was by the ACS, not by the state survey process, but they do a lot with your registry and validate and all this other stuff. So when we go out and look at hospitals through the Texas TTAF's process, we don't have access to the registry to look at their data, and we can ask them to pull up data, but many of them use the Maven system now, and so we don't log into Maven and look at their data. So the question is maybe in the designation process, we need to start asking for some reports regarding the registry before we actually arrive, because it is a criteria deficiency to not provide data to the registry, correct? So that would be one way to build that system where people have to submit that data.
Well, and the other part of that is that survey, if it's identified that the facility is not submitting the data, then that would be recorded as a deficiency on the survey report. That gives us the information to then have a conversation with the CEO and the medical director and the program manager to say, okay, this is what was identified at survey. Talk to us about why you have this deficiency and how it is going to get corrected.
See, I think that's great, but the issue is if I go out and let's say look at Scott's hospital, and Scott says we're submitting to the registry, I don't have a login to look at Scott's data through Maven. I guess I can make Scott do it instead of look over his shoulder, but it looks to me like there should be something coming back from the state to say, they are sending data into the state and it is validated data. I know we can't do it today, we probably can't do it to June, but at some point in time we should be able to tie those two together.
And Chris, that is a possibility with the new system?
Yes.
Short and sweet.
So the college, so the ACS gives you a report that you submit to the National Trauma Data Bank, right? And so when you go through an ACS survey, they request to see that, and they can
The
check.
validation report, yeah.
Right. So, I mean, couldn't the state work with these centers when they're going to go through designation to make sure on an annual basis they receive something that says, yes, you've met your requirement for data submission to the state registry?
I mean, I just print my data, my validation report, and I have it in a book per month and say, you know,
Right.
what it is.
Whenever a facility submits data to the registry, they get submission feedback reports.
Right.
Saying that record was submitted, X amount of records were submitted, X amount of records were accepted. And so this feedback report could be used as a tool to validate if a record, if the facility has been submitting data to the registry or not.
So we can work with Brenda to make sure that becomes part of the requirements for the reviews.
Right. That's what I'm talking about. You're not still, you don't know if you're current. Right. Right. Yeah.
The short answer, yes, a report like that can be created, and it could be based on date the record was submitted into the registry, aka case create date, and then compare it to discharge date on the record to see what is the timing from when the record, the 90 days after the discharge date, to when it was in the registry to see if it's within that 90 days or if it's exceeding that 90 days. So yes, it is possible.
So again, the goal is not to restrict people from becoming successful. The goal is to hold people accountable for what the rules actually say.
Correct. So we could create a report that shows the number of records that were submitted by that facility, and then the proportion of records that were submitted within whatever time period you're looking for. It could be dichotomized less than 90 days, greater than 90 days, on a monthly basis or something like that. So yes, we could generate something like that.
Okay. Any other comments about data from the committee?
Jory, can I just add one thing? Prior to this new registry coming in, designation coordinators did verify submission into the registry by the facilities, and we are currently working with Chris for EMS and trauma to get those reports again so that we can verify their compliance.
So you're talking about your team doing that?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Anybody from the audience have any comments regarding the data?
Jory, are you going to talk about EMS? Because one thing I found today sitting through the, I can't get up to go to the thing. So one of the things I found in Chris's report today to the EMS committee that I think is very valid for at least this group to know is that the validation of the data for EMS is very low. Like 65% is validated and the rest.
Chris, you need to sing to us.
So we actually.
Sorry, Chris.
No, that's okay. I like this because this is the point of the registry. It's there for a reason. It's not there to just collect data and not do anything with it. We actually created a very similar presentation specific for the Trauma Systems Committee.
About EMS?
Not about EMS, but about the trauma records that we receive. And it's only a couple slides. In fact, we could just skip to the one slide just to give an example of what we're talking about with valid, null, null, and the data coming in for a specific data element.
You have a slide?
We do, Prakash.
Let's see the data.
But as we move forward into the continuum of care registry, the validation of EMS records are going to be as important.
Correct.
It just was way higher than I expected. Thanks, Chris.
So as we're talking about, for a long time, we've been talking about getting data into the registry, Well, we're at that point. We're all getting data into the registry. And so now we need to start looking at what is the data that's coming into the registry. And so what Prakash is going to show you today is just one data element, right, Prakash? Yeah. Just one data element, and looking at what were the type of responses that came in 2013. And then break it down to what we call as a valid response, a valid null response, or a null response. we're just gonna select 3.
Okay, so for this presentation, actually, we are looking at the variable called condition on discharge in the hospitalization records. In this slide on the left, we have a pie chart with 65% of good recovery and 28% of moderate disability, and there are severe disability for 2%. Main thing is the not applicable and unknown. These are the 2% total. These, the not applicable unknown, they are not providing any information, even though they are valid responses that are accepted in the registry, but because they are not providing any useful or information for making any judgments, they are called as valid null. And the missing information, the records that are having missing information about this variable, they are called as null. So overall, we have in this slide on the pie on the right side, we have 73% of records with real information that can be analyzed and make some inferences about the data set. The almost 27% of records that do not have any information that you can use for analysis.
Correct, and out of that 27%, the largest proportion is data that's missing, meaning there was no value entered. So if you look at all the data submitted for the state for 2013 on condition on discharge, 25% of it was missing.
Chris, do you remember what that number is off the top of your head for EMS?
I can't remember. So one of them was 65, that was
35%, I think. 35%.
35.
I was going the positive way because I wanted my to sound positive. So 65% of the call type was valid, and 59% of the cause of injury was valid.
So
I went positively instead of negative.
So call type is if it was medical trauma, unknown or not reported. So 65% of the time we had a medical trauma or trauma. The remaining times we either had not applicable, unknown, or just no data entered. So we can do this for every single data element that we collect.
I think this is wonderful. We want you to do that, but turn off the mics. Can you not do it till June? I mean, really, this can really destroy our whole campaign. Thank you. This. Anybody have any comments on that? Anybody from the committee? No additional comments about data? That just made everybody happy, huh? Okay, so now we're to the Trauma Medical Director's Best Practice Work Group. Brian chairs that. Brian's not here. So I can tell you there's a couple of things going on. We gave the group some templates for the trauma PI plan. And the American College of Surgeons currently is coming out with a template for the new taxonomy. There's a meeting that's been held. There's another meeting that was going to be held in March. And their challenge or their goal is to be able to develop a template and forms specifically for you to be able to move forward with the new taxonomy. So that needs to be put on hold till that happens so that there obviously are matches in the system. The geriatric best practice guidelines from the TQIP was also one of the items, as well as a massive transfusion to be considered. And the other item we asked the trauma medical directors to look at was the telemedicine opportunities and how to use that in trauma. So we will put that back on the agenda for the next meeting, or if Brian doesn't arrive. Dr. Gandhi, you, Dr. Winshaw, you have any comments on these subjects?
There's two other items that'll be coming out. One is trauma brain injury guidelines, as well as orthopedic injury guidelines. And those will be part of the quality measures that will be looked at in TQIP.
Dr. Winshaw?
No, and my suggestion would be that we put a priority in there for, again, some type of system for sharing imaging data in the telemedicine world.
I saw Terry Valentino in the audience. I didn't see Kelly Stowell here. Not here. Okay, so we'll put this on hold for the next meeting. Again, the goal of this particular subject matter is we ask Kelly to look at the non-physician providers or the advanced practice providers or mid-levels, whatever term you choose, to look at creating a template for job descriptions to be able to be used in the trauma centers, organizational structures, orientation manuals, expectations and training, and then skills credentialing. Just a template as a tool to guide for other individuals and other trauma centers. The Regional Advisory Council, Wanda, this was an item that we had asked you to work with. We also turfed this to work with the Brian's group with the strategic plan. So I know Wanda's here somewhere. Do you want to? Okay. So what I wanted to do is sort of change the focus, because I think we need the strategic plan started. But one of the things this committee is, looking at trauma systems, but we also want to know, the RACS process is extremely important. If you don't have a functioning RAC, then there's obviously a hindrance to the system's development. So I wanted to ask the RACs to start coming and giving reports to this particular committee. And so